JavaFX is an exciting new graphical user interface tool, or GUI tool, from Java. In the past, developers would use tools like AWT or Swing, but JavaFX represents the next generation of user interfaces. JavaFX does require certain methods to be in place for launching, so this video is going to focus on the anatomy of a JavaFX application. Before we get into the different methods that are involved in a JavaFX application, let's take a look at a couple of concepts we need to understand first. First is the concept of a stage. And a stage is basically a window. You can think of a stage as the kind of ordinary windows you see everywhere. They'll have a minimize button, maximize button, close button, and a title bar. The next concept that we want to get into would be a scene. And a scene is really what is inside the window. It's the content of the window. And a scene, every scene in JavaFX has something called a root node. And the root node is generally a layout pane, which we'll talk about in an upcoming lecture. But for now, a layout pane is just a container to hold all of your objects. So it can hold a button, it can hold text fields, anything you need to can be held inside of that pane. We're going to examine the 5 steps needed to set up a JavaFX application, starting with step 1. Step 1 requires us to create a class. This is the class we're going to create, Hello World, and Hello World is going to extend application. Application is the superclass. It's part of the JavaFX library, and therefore my Hello World class is going to inherit all the attributes and all the methods that it needs to do to be a good JavaFX application. You'll notice that I have a package here. That's fine. I also have several import statements, which I'm not going to show you. There's a lot of them. These import statements bring in the JavaFX library of controls that the Hello World application is going to use. The other thing in the import is logging. Logging is a great tool. We're not going to discuss it much in this video, but you notice here I've created a logger, and that logger is going to use to keep track of certain things as I go through the GUI. Loggers are so much more useful than just doing a system.out.println, and they can be left in your code when it goes into production. And what's typically a pattern in loggers is you actually name it with a string, and that string very often matches the name of your package. The other thing you will notice is that this application has a main method. JavaFX GUIs do not require a main method, but it's a very common way to set up your GUI. And I'm doing some logging here just to keep track of where I am, because I'll talk about threads in an upcoming video. But the most important part of this whole thing is this application launch. And so application launch is a static method of the application class. And when you launch it, you can launch it with the same arguments that come in through the main method. The launch method is the method that begins the entire GUI. And from this point on, the JavaFX interface takes over. So as I mentioned, typically your GUIs will have the main method as part of the class, but you don't have to do it that way. Here's a different class. Here's a class called driver, and driver is going to, again, do the application launch. But this time, because the driver class is not the GUI, the application launch method is using the version that takes in the class to launch along with the arguments from main. And the class to launch would be the name of the class that is an instance of a JavaFX application. On to step 2. Step 2, like all the other steps, is managed by the JavaFX runtime library. Step 2, however, is an optional step. Step 2 is to call the init method. So your GUI might have an init method, and the purpose of the init method is to do any processing that you want to occur before the GUI launches. The init method is not required to be overridden in your class. Down here, you can see what's in my Hello World application. I have overridden the init method, and all I really did was just log the fact that I was there. It didn't really do anything. Again, the init method is an optional method. Notice that in the superclass, the application, there already is a body for init, but the body is just an empty body. It's concrete, but it does nothing. So if you don't need an init, fine, don't use it. But if you needed to do some processing before the GUI launches, you override the init method in your class, and you add in here all the logic that you need. Now in step 3, this is where the GUI works. This is the main guts of the GUI, and what we do is we invoke the start method. And you can see here in my Hello World application, I have defined the start method, which again, I overrode from the superclass. So this time, the superclass method in JavaFX application is an abstract method, so it has no body. So I have to provide a body for start, and start's going to be how my GUI runs. Fine. Let's take a look at it. The start method is going to do a lot of things. Most things I'm not going to explain in this video, but I will explain in a subsequent video. But the point here is your start method needs to work the same way as a main method would. In other words, it shouldn't be long. If the start method is very, very, very long, it becomes real hard to read. So like any other good controlling method, like start, like main, I do a lot of calling these methods. So I have a method called setUpControls. I have a method called setStage. And a lot of the work for the GUI is done in these methods of the class. These are static private methods. In a nutshell, what am I doing? A few things. I'm logging again to show you what thread I'm using in my start method. That's fine. Next thing I'm doing is I'm making a border pane. Now the border pane is going to be the control in JavaFX into which I place all my buttons and all my labels. So I make the pane there. In the very next line, I set the style of the pane. And this gives you an example of how you can color things or use styles. What JavaFX is doing is it's drawing a lot from CSS and using a lot of CSS styles like background color. And this particular method, the setStyle method, is going to turn the background of my border pane to pink. Next thing that we do is we run this method called setUpControls. I'll show you that method in an upcoming video. This method basically builds all the buttons, it builds all the labels, and it places them onto the main pane. Next, we have to make our scene. And remember, the scene belongs to the stage. So we make the scene, and as we said previously, the scene requires a node to be its root node. That root node is main pane, which of course was my border pane that I made previously. So now I've set a scene, and in the scene I've established what the main root node is. It's this border pane. Okay, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to set the stage. And again, we'll look at this method in an upcoming video. But this method basically says, now that I have the scene, this scene is the scene that belongs to the stage. So remember, the scene is the contents, and the stage is the window. Like I said, Once we started the start method, now we've transferred control to the GUI itself. And here's the GUI, and I can be in this GUI for a while, and I can decide that I want to click this button, and then I want to click this button, and then I want to click this button. And basically, with this type of programming, this is called event-based programming. In other words, we have no idea what the sequence of operations is. Unlike other Java coding we've done before, where everything follows a sequence, here I have no idea. Will you push this button first? Will you push this button first? We don't know. So what happens is we basically have to have code that's lying in wait. It's just sitting there hoping that someone will push the button, and when they push the button, that code will activate. So that's what's happening in step 3. And so step 4 is pretty much just saying, you know, after we've started our GUI, let's just wait for it to end. And we stay in step 4 for a long time. We stay in step 4 until we either close the main application window by clicking that X button, or we have an exit command in the program, which we don't have here, that would terminate the GUI. But as I said, during this time, the GUI is just sitting there waiting to respond to user interactions. In step 4, we were waiting for the GUI to end. Someone clicked the close button, someone exited the application, and now it's over. But there's one last step left. This last step is to call the stop method. And the stop method is very much like the init method. It's optional. And this stop method is used for your GUI to do any post-processing. If you need to close databases or save some files, you can do it after the GUI is over. So again, very similar to the method we saw before, init. In my Hello World JavaFX application, I do override the method, and all I'm really doing is just logging the fact that I'm in the stop method. So I'm not doing very much, but that's the place where you could put all the code that you need to end your program after the GUI is done. And like before, in the JavaFX application class, there's a concrete method, but an empty method called stop. So you do not have to override it, but if you need to do post-processing, this is how you would do it. And that is it. That's the anatomy of a JavaFX application. You start off by making an instance of the application class, and you have to do application.launch. You can do that inside the main method of the application itself, or you can do it in a separate driver class. The second thing you have to do, if you want to, is to call the init method. That's if you had any pre-processing. The third most important thing is to call the start method. The start method is going to launch the GUI and get things underway. The fourth is just to let the GUI do its thing and wait for it to end. And the last is to call the stop method if you need to do any post-processing. So in conclusion, I want to talk to you a little bit about all these things I've been logging. You've seen me call the thread logger method many times in the GUI in different methods. And all I'm doing in this thread logger method is I'm using my logger and I am logging the name of the current thread along with the current thread object itself. This way I can see what threads are being used in JavaFX at different points in time. So we start off with main, and in the main method you can see that I am in the main thread. But then I move to init all the way down to stop, and when I'm in this area you can see that my thread is the JavaFX launcher the entire time, including when I was pushing buttons Here I push the hello button inside the while I'm waiting for the application to stop. But notice that there are two different threads in play here. There is the main thread for my main method, and then there is the JavaFX launcher thread for the remainder of the application. This is the first time maybe that you've seen one class that runs using two different threads. So that about wraps it up. In future videos, we'll discuss in more depth how to set up those controls and how to lay them out into your GUI. And we'll have another video lecture that will talk about event programming. Thank you so much.